Can you start that?
Yeah, that's recording.
Let's talk about toilets.
Toilets. The ever-present final conversation that will happen between any two boaters. So,
Before we bought a boat, everyone told us that whenever you meet boaters, you always end up talking about toilets, and it's true.
it's absolutely true. Anytime we get into a conversation with anybody for more than about 20 minutes, it falls onto toilets. You know?
And when we started our channel, we made 3 videos about toilets.
Yeah.
And it's been a while since we talked about toilets, so we feel like it's time to have another toilet video. Because people have been asking us how we're getting on with the composting toilet. Now we've had it for about 8 months.
Yeah.
And the truth is, we don't love it.
Well, yeah, no. Yeah,
we don't hate it.
We don't hate it. It was a definite improvement over the pump out situation. I definitely wouldn't trade it for a pump out.
No.
Wouldn't even consider a pump out. I would consider cassettes, but I think in order to get kind of like when we sit still for a few days in a row, I think we'd need like 4 cassettes. And the reality is that I wouldn't want to be fighting to get to an LSAN every 2 days, so we'd need to have quite a few cassettes.
Whereas with the composting toilet, we can store any amount of deposit for any amount of time, really.
Sort of, yeah, pretty much. But basically, we can go 3 weeks before having to empty it.
40 deposits.
40 deposits.
Well, 40 to 50 deposits in the solid tank.
Depending on the deposit and how much the depositor has been eating. The liquids tank has to be emptied more often, but that's actually not that hard because in addition to LSANs, you can pretty much find any public toilet and just
walk in with your little...
It looks a little strange, coming in with
your little handbag.
your tank. But you walk in with the tank and,
and then you go into the cubicle.
Somewhat disturb somebody who's sitting nearby by going like, good Lord, that person's got a urinary.
By going, glug, 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 glug.
Yeah. So.
And then worst case scenario, if you're not near a public toilet or an LSAN.
And you're way out in the rural areas.
You are legally allowed to just pour it on the land, but you have to be a certain distance away from the water. I think it's 10
meters away from the water or water courses.
We would never do it near like someone's back garden, because often you have back gardens, but you're legally allowed to do it. I'll look up the legislation and put it.
Well, it's the EA I think it was the EA's recommendation was at least 10 meters, because at the end of the day, plants like nitrogen.
Mm-hmm. With the solids, the ideal situation for us would be as if we could store the solids for 6 months and actually compost them down, instead of just because when you're in the toilet itself, you're not composting, you're just
desiccating.
Yeah.
You're just getting rid of the water.
Mm-hmm.
I think it'd be great if we could sort of figure out, and we've been trying.
6 boxes on the roof, or a stack of boxes on the bow or stern. If you had a mooring, then it'd be very, very simple to do. And then the other thing that would be good is if next to every LSAN, the CRT installed, a big composting bin where you could just put it in or compost down with everyone else's compost.
But the thing is, actual composting really requires heat, and it requires, biome, so it needs worms and or bacteria. Mm-hmm. And the toilet is not really doing that. It's just not conducive to it.
It doesn't smell, so that is a real... it does have a smell, but it's not a sewage smell. It's just a kind of earthy smell, which is not unpleasant. It's not particularly unpleasant. So there's lots of real positive things about it, but it's just not... It's not the ideal solution.
It was like we were trying to make this balancing act between price, number of touch points, and sort of amount of kind of disgustingness.
Mm-hmm. And it's not that disgusting. Well, we kind of have this agreement where Michael does the liquids and I do the solids. The solids, obviously, Michael said we're doing it about every 3 weeks. And we do actually have a bit of paper on the wall in our bathroom, which I called the poo diary, so we can count the number of deposits.
Which is very helpful for both experimentation on trying to figure out what sort of amounts of carbon and coir, and or we've tried coir, we've tried wood chips, we've added at one point enzymes. So we've had some experimentation of that while we had to track just how many deposits were being made.
Quite funny when you have visitors and they go into your bathroom and they see that you're counting your poo.
Yeah, with this nice little sort of Comic Sans font at the top.
And
the poo diaries.
A little drawing of the poo emojis.
Yeah.
So every 3 weeks we'll need to empty the solids tank, and
she'll need to empty the solids tank.
It's not a big deal.
I'm not so grossed out by it that I can't do it or anything. It's not like I'm retching or anything like that. It's more just that I'm going to spend 15 minutes going, why didn't we buy the flame toilet? Yeah. Why the hell didn't we buy the flame toilet?
And I don't want to listen to him saying, why didn't we buy the flame toilet? So it's much easier for me to do it. Actually, our first experiment, our first usage of the composting toilet was pretty bad.
That was bad.
We didn't use the right amount of water in the coir. So we had far too much water in there, which basically meant that after 2 weeks we had a mouldy bowl of
actual sewage.
And it was disgusting.
At first we were sort of doing 2 inches of coir at the bottom of the bucket.
And then adding it.
Yeah, and then adding more coir as it was being used. And then we tried 2 inches at the bottom of the bucket and switching to adding more sawdust, like pet bedding.
It was a bit more bulky though.
It was a lot more bulky, so we got less usages out of it, had to change it more often, and the result was just bulkier.
I prefer the coir, definitely.
Yeah, and since then we've sort of moved to what we're doing right now. The enzymes, we added those on 2 of them. They didn't really do anything at all.
We don't know if they did anything. Like, how would you measure it?
Yeah, well, I mean, there was a cut down in smell.
And then the other thing is if you don't clean it out, if you leave a little bit of stuff when you empty it, that should help.
It does. It helps the cycle begin again.
Yeah.
We're putting coir in at the bottom that's much deeper than we had been in the beginning, which was an important step because having more coir in there dries things out quicker. We still do have a little too much moisture in there, which...
That might be diet.
Might be diet. I think it's probably airflow, really. Like, There was the question of whether or not it was sort of splashback liquids. But if there was a significant amount of actual liquid gold getting in there, you would end up with quite a reek because that would create a different type of biome. So we don't have that problem. So I think it's water. So it's probably either condensation, because unfortunately our bathroom is kind of the coldest room in the boat. The interior of the bucket, in order to do proper composting, should actually be quite warm, which is probably why we're not getting any composting, because it's in the coldest room and it's actually quite cold in there. So that might be leading to additional, condensation.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about user error, Michael.
User error, yes. So this is why you need to have a good relationship.
When we first got the toilet, we were using coffee filters. So the coffee filter would sit in the bowl, the flap would be closed, you'd do whatever deposits, like 1s and 2s. The 1s would supposedly drain forward into the liquids tank, and the 2s would sit in the coffee filter and then drop through.
Mm-hmm.
But because it's a coffee filter, it's going to
absorb a certain amount of 1.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that the stuff that's absorbed is going to come into the number 2 chamber, and also each coffee filter is adding bulk. So
and the agitator thing does not break them up very well at all.
So they were like just getting wrapped around. So we made the decision. Well, I was brave first. That instead of putting the coffee filter in with the flap closed, doing your deposits, and then opening the flap to drop it through, what we do now is we open the flap, and the deposits go straight into the various areas.
But this is where user error can occur, because at 4 o'clock in the morning, and you need to go to the, bank, then you might forget to move that sort of handle, and
make your deposit with the flap closed.
With the flap closed,
which makes a mess of the flap.
Yes, which then the flap moves in a complex fashion, leading to smear, would be the word.
My worst user error was not long ago. It was about 2 weeks ago. Oh, it's not even funny. So Michael, being the
Chivalrous.
one responsible for emptying the liquids tanks, got up in the morning, disconnected the attached liquids tank, took the other liquid tank, which was also full, and told me that he was going to empty them. Meanwhile, I woke up, got up, very sleepy, really needed to make a number 1 deposit, went to the bathroom, sat down, relaxed, and
So I came back and was getting yelled at quite rapidly.
I wasn't. No, hang on. I yelled at you because...
Well, you yelled at me because I said something about why didn't you look to see whether or not it was there before.
Because you always... I wonder if the tank's attached.
Yeah, I mean, because, like, I always check, but, like...
Let's not get into this again.
Yeah, we're not...
Yeah, I was mainly yelling at you for that. I didn't mind the fact that you laughed solidly for half an hour at the fact that I peed all over my feet.
I was sitting at the front of the boat going, I know I'm going to get grabbed for this, but I can't stop laughing.
I won't go into any more details, but it was a low
point.
A low moment.
The Airhead is a fairly decent composting toilet, and I would say that it is actually the best engineered of the bunch. Mm-hmm. That's why we chose it. It is also small enough that it fits into our location, so we had looked at others. We'd looked at the Nature's Head, and we looked at the Kildwick toilets. I had heard some complaints about, like, the hardware, specifically the little screws on the liquids container and on the solids bucket where it attaches to the ground and things like that. And these were all seemed fairly minor, and they were. It arrived. Installation wasn't very hard. I was feeling like, yeah, the hardware could be better. There's these washers, especially these little black plastic washers on the liquids tank that get bound.
Every time.
Every single time.
And so you're reefing around on this full liquids tank.
That's sloshing.
You don't want it to slosh over the top.
Yeah. You have to get the tank out from below. Like, you have to angle it from the bottom and then come down
so if
to
it's
get the lid
very
on top.
full, when you angle it, you risk.
Yeah. This is where the Nature's Head improved on it in a way. In the Nature's Head, you lift up the top. Unfortunately, you're exposed to all the solids.
Which is what put us off that one.
Yeah.
We were like, oh, it's good that you don't have to...
But you get to drag the liquids tank out vertically, so you don't have to worry about the liquids tank, kind of being angled. So I think they were trying to respond to a design flaw.
Yeah,
but that is a design flaw.
But then every time you take the liquids tank out,
you are exposed to the solids, which is probably not a problem, but it's a bit of a touch point sort of put off. So there's the agitator inside the solids tank.
Which is basically what you turn on the outside, and that spins on the inside to mix up the solids. But nothing gets into the corners and...
Yeah, it has the same problems as, this sounds a little bit weird, but like if you've got a food mixer with a badly shaped arm on it, you never actually get the dough being moved around.
So the quire sits in the corners, and it's still the liquid still soaks through into it, but it's not distributed through the...
Yeah, so you end up with sort of regions of very dry, and then a bolus in the middle of mixed up, mainly wet. And there's really an art to figuring out, like, too much agitation leaves it far too liquid. Too little agitation means that it separates out. And
so what agitation are you doing?
I'm trying to do 1/2 turn every deposit. Early on, it was like maybe 4 rotations per deposit. Like, how many are you supposed to do?
We got a bit carried away to start with.
Yeah.
Really mix this up.
So yeah, when you're rotating it fast, what you end up with is more smell coming through the air vent. When you rotate it slowly, you get less smell, and you seem to get a little bit better distribution of... it seems to dry out in there a little bit better. But yeah, there is...
But who knew?
Right. And it's not exactly clear from any of the instructions.
And everyone you ask will have a different recommendation.
Yeah. Now, then you get into the sort of just... They're not so much design... Well, part of it's a design flaw, although I think they're improving this with the newer models. But the liquids tank, for instance... and I'm not going to do too much to demonstrate this here, but basically, there's a sight glass that you're supposed to be able to see through. It's semi-opaque to try and make it so you're not looking at anything too, nasty. But the reality is you never can see through this thing. It's essentially useless. The opacity of this plastic makes it so you can never really tell where the liquid level is.
That, you know, there has been occasions when we've got to capacity,
overfilled,
which is not, and that's been in the middle of the night. Which
basically, these tanks should have like a vertical sight glass type thing. They should have a piece of plastic inside there that's the same sort of clear, semi-opaque stuff, but even more clear, and it should go down the whole length. So you should be able to see, or possibly strips over here or something. The other problems, and basically all my problems for the Airhead more or less come down to the liquid tank. The other problem is this profile. This thing is totally flat at the top. It's basically a big square, right? So when you go to tilt this thing, this large neck here where the liquids come out of is almost instantaneously turned into a really good way of spraying stuff. And there's no way to get air in on the far side, so you get kind of a suction, or what's the word? A siphon effect as it flips over. And all of a sudden, what goes from sort of a controllable stream becomes a cone of nastiness that just isn't that easy to deal with. And then there's the last thing, which is really just what I call a design problem, which is this flat top means that when you've turned it over and you've completely emptied it, you have to slosh it back and forth over and over and over again to try and get the liquids out of these, you know, spaces in the sides, because those voids just hold liquid that will not go anywhere near the funnel. So if this thing was funnel shaped, like you have like on a milk jug or something.
like if it came up here.
Yeah.
And this lid isn't that...
It isn't at all sealed.
No, because I had another user error issue where I had our box of recycling and I balanced this on top of the box. So I was carrying it like this. And this kind of tilted a bit and was like banging on my chest. And a little bit of wee-wee came out of the top and ran down my clean t-shirt.
Most unfortunate.
Most unfortunate, because it wasn't my wee or just my wee. It was Michael's wee too. And I think we'd also had a guest that week. So it was some stranger's wee.
Overall feelings about our toilet. I think that there's a major business to be had in somebody deciding to invest in making composting toilets and hiring an
engineer,
actual like industrial design engineer, somebody who designs it on a computer, has enough knowledge of materials and everything to make it out of the proper things, because there are toilets out there that are definitely assembled with, you know, like the vanity mechanism to cover the solids and everything. The one in the Airhead is pretty good, but it's got a little spring, and that spring has already started to rust, and the places in the corners where it attaches to a couple of little, basically Phillips head screws has started to corrode. The spring will eventually go. When the spring goes, this whole mechanism fails without having to get in there and replace it. That mechanism could be made of just 2 moving pieces of plastic. There's no reason for all of these additional pieces of moving material. There's no reason other than convenience and kind of amateur design that requires this spring. There's a number of components in this toilet where I swear somebody with real industrial design experience could eliminate the problem entirely. There's also, like, the place where the air connection is should just be a bayonet. It should just be something that just goes in and you click it into place and then you click it off. Same thing with the actual liquids tank. It should go up and bayonet on. It should bayonet off and come off. It would cost a little more in the initial design.
But the thing is, these toilets aren't cheap. Like, I feel...
No, they're not at all cheap.
I feel like what we paid for this toilet was way, 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 way more than what it was worth. I don't understand how they are as much as they are.
Well, and I do, because it comes down to they're selling so few units that they have to sort of scale it up the price. And they're building them by hand. And they do have a lot of complicated moving components, but I swear a good industrial designer, somebody who really knew their way around the plastics and stuff, and you deal with the right sort of company in, say, China or whatever to do the injection molding, and you should be able to get this thing down to a cheaper price, sell it to more people.
Well, that's the thing, like, I feel personally that people in houses should be composting, because like the amount of water that gets flushed down toilets and the cost of pumping that water to houses and processing that water and cleaning that water and the pollution going wherever it goes, like,
it's just enormous.
It's crazy. Everyone should be using composting toilets and creating their own compost and composting it down fully and putting it...
Yeah, especially if you live in a house in which you have a garden.
Because I feel if I ever live in a house again, I want a composting toilet.
Yeah.
But I want a better one.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's the thing. You want a better one, and you want a place to do the composting in. You want a place where it can actually, with worms and everything,
but you think how much,
down.
like, you know, an average family, every time they flush, it's either 3 or 6 litres.
Yeah, yeah. It's an inane amount of water being used. But look at what's happened in major cities, like in London.
What's that thing called?
Fatberg.
Yeah.
Right, where people flush everything.
Like
and
baby wipes and nappies and
things that shouldn't be going down the
sanitary
toilet.
pads and...
Yeah.
So what would you do in your house? What would you do with your liquids? You'd still have to flush them.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not saying you get rid of the whole problem. It's just you reduce the problem of using liquids to flush solids.
Yeah.
You know.
Which is completely like we've learned, it's completely unnecessary.
Yeah, and it's really like on a boat. It is
creates its own problems.
It's got its own set of problems. But if you were living in a house, you eliminate most of those problems very quickly, and yet you'd still need better design. You'd need, you know, better or less hardware, way less moving parts.
Yeah. Whereas, so if there was a demand from people in houses, then, you know, the scaling issue would get solved. Demand would go up, design would get better, solutions would get better, and the price would come down. Yeah,
and yet this is where there's this kind of funny thing, which is that competing with these composting toilets is the Cinderella and the Flame toilets. And the Cinderella is the only one that uses LPG, so it's the only one applicable on a boat. Most of the other ones use just electrical power. And their price is as high as they are because they are so well engineered. But if you got that good engineering being mass manufactured, that price would come down. As people use those things, those prices would go down. So I'm still of the opinion that it's like, if you have if you live in a house and you have a usable capacity for the actual humanure, like if you either have in your land plot, yeah, it's what people use for it. If in your land plot you have a garden and you don't mind the idea of using this stuff, and you've got somewhere where you can put it in bins for 6 months and then start using it.
Not necessarily even like for
not for food necessarily, but like
your roses.
For your roses and things. Or if you were
people go to the garden centre to buy compost, make your own.
Right, exactly, and you can mix it with compost for from vegetable matter and all those things, which has to go through the same process. So if you have either your own ability to use it, or you develop a system as a town or whatever for collecting it and then using it in some meaningful fashion, the composting thing makes a lot of sense. And if you don't, the flame toilets make a lot of sense. Slightly off topic, but basically 8 months in, would we buy the Airhead again?
If budget wasn't an issue, then you would get the Cinderella. I know you would. You'd probably just spend the money on it anyway, like you'd invest in that.
I'd see it as an investment.
Yeah.
I personally would see that as an investment in my own mental health, my own sort of, level of comfort and stuff. But also, like...
I'd love to know anyone who's got it, because when we were at Crick last year, he'd sold 4. And so
3, I think, were for wide beams and 1 was for a narrowboat.
So there are people using them, but...
Yeah, love to hear about them. If they weren't an option because of price or anything, then I'd still go for composting over the other options. Yeah. I just wish that the composting toilet was a bit better designed. Yeah.
So anyway, I hope everyone who's been asking about a composting toilet, I hope that answered your questions. Probably didn't, we're a bit vague.
We don't want to discourage anybody. We want to encourage you, but we want you to understand that there are realistic things.
Yeah, we don't want to be like, this is the best thing, because it's not.
It's closer to the best thing, but it needs work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway.
There we go.
Hope that was useful. That's our last ever toilet video.
And we're going to go clean our hands. You have to have a good relationship. Because we're talking about this the day after our anniversary, and we're fine, no problems. I've never been happier. But at the same time, it's true. Just imagine it's a big bucket, and there's a cake batter about a 1.5 foot in diameter and 8 inches deep.
Big old cake.
Big cake batter. Big cake batter.
But then you're intimate with your dog's deposit, so, it's just deposit.
I've never been intimate with my dog's deposits. the washers go almost immediately, and there's a spider. Oh, yeah. I don't know where he went. There he is. Nope. Where'd he go now? Spider paws. Spiders don't have paws. And so you end up with slosh and spoop.
Anyway.
Spoop? Did I just invent the word?
Spoop.
Spoop. Slosh and
Poop.
and foulness.